All right. Hello again, everybody. Really happy to see all of you. Happy spring. It really feels like spring. Flowers are blooming. I'm going to be introducing a new sermon series. So for the next 5 or 6 weeks, we're going to spend time discussing the topic of restoration. And restoration is a very big part of our faith. It's a kind of unique aspect of our faith that most other religions don't really talk about so much, but for us is like really crucial. However, it also has that aspect of if you've been in our faith for a long time, or if you've listened to a lot of lectures or read the Divine Principle, it's one of those words that you're like, yeah, restoration. Like you've heard it so many times. But I titled our series Restoration for Real. Because I feel like restoration is really where the rubber hits the road, where the rubber meets the road in our lives. It's where our faith, we have an opportunity to make our faith real, and where our ideals get practice. And it's where we really have to face ourselves. It's not something we're going to say, yeah, I believe in that. But it's like, if I believe in that, then there's many opportunities right now in front of me to actually do something. And I feel like it also, when we spend time thinking about restoration, we spend time studying it, spend time practicing it, this is also where we have the opportunity to make big changes in our life. Sometimes it doesn't take much. We just need to restore one relationship or restore an aspect of our heart that's been running away from God. Sometimes we just need to change one little thing and it can make a big difference in our life. So my hope and my prayer is that as we go into restoration throughout this series and over the next few weeks, that there's an opportunity for each one of us here to experience some restoration of something in our lives. And by the end of this sermon series, each one of us will be able to look back and say, I restored that. I am not the same person I was on, what is today? April 27th? I'm not the same person I was on April 27th. So restoration is our key to understanding how God has worked through history, why certain events and things had to happen the way they did, or if they failed in restoration, why they turned out the way they did. In the Divine Principle, the topic of restoration is the largest section in the book. It covers all of biblical history. But restoration is not just to understand the past. Restoration does need to happen, and it is happening on a cosmic level. But just as importantly, and practically, restoration needs to happen in each of our lives, in our families' lives. Restoration isn't just for understanding in our minds, theoretically, theologically. Restoration holds the keys and the tools to each little step that we need to make to break chains of the past, undo mistakes of our ancestors, and undo the mistakes that we have made ourselves so that we can stand blameless before God. I'm going to share quite a bit today directly from the Divine Principle because the Bible doesn't really have a lot of pointed words directly towards restoration. And the Divine Principle has the most simple and succinct way to introduce and explain it. But I'm also just sharing snippets. I actually really encourage everybody at the beginning of this series, sometime this week, go home and read the one section, Introduction to Restoration. It's just like 12 pages, but there's so much good stuff in there. I feel like I have a lot I wanted to share, but it wouldn't really be useful for me to read the whole section. So I'm just going to share snippets, but please, I encourage you to just read that introduction. Okay, so I'm going to begin by sharing some from the Divine Principle. The providence of restoration refers to God's work to restore human beings to our original, unfallen state, so that we may fulfill the purpose of creation. So if we look into the history of the providence of restoration, we learn about how Adam and Eve, right, were born without original sin and started to grow through the formation stage and the growth stage, but at the top of the growth stage, fell away from God and fell even below the original formation stage, right? Below the stage of like creation. So the whole process of restoration is like restoring humanity back up to that point. Okay, keep going. All right. If the first human ancestors had not fallen, but had reached perfection and become one in heart with God, then they would have lived relating only with God. However, due to their fall, they joined in a kinship of blood with Satan, which compelled them to deal with him as well. Immediately after the fall, when Adam and Eve had the original sin, but had not yet committed any subsequent good or evil deeds, they found themselves in the midway position, a position between God and Satan, where they were relating with both. As a consequence, all their descendants, us also, are in the midway position. Take, for example, a person in the fallen world who does not believe in Jesus, but leads a conscientious life. As long as he leads a virtuous life, Satan cannot drag him into hell. Yet, God cannot bring him into paradise either, as long as he does not believe in Jesus. He remains in the midway position. Therefore, until people make a condition through which God can claim them as his own, there is no way God can restore them to the heavenly side. On the other hand, Satan acknowledges that God is the creator of human beings. Unless Satan finds some condition through which he can attack a fallen person, he also cannot arbitrarily claim him for his side. Therefore, a fallen person will go to God's side if he makes good conditions, and to Satan's side if he makes evil conditions. What then is the meaning of restoration through indemnity? When someone has lost his original position or state, he must make some condition to be restored to it. The making of such conditions of restitution is called indemnity. For example, to recover lost reputation, position, or health, one must make the necessary effort or pay the due price. Suppose two people who once loved each other come to be on bad terms. They must make some condition of reconciliation before the love they previously enjoyed can be revived. In like manner, it is necessary for human beings who have fallen from God's grace into corruption to fulfill some condition before they can be restored to their true standing. So I think this is helpful to understand, and I kind of picture it as it's like that example. If, for example, you lose your health, it's God can't just say, "No, you're healthy. You have my grace and you are healthy." It doesn't necessarily mean that our body is healthy, right? We have to, if we've been eating unhealthy foods, we need to restore our body to health by eating healthy foods. If we have, if we've damaged a relationship, I know some people who are like, well, let's just forget about the past. I love you now. But I think it's very hard for that person to believe that unless you've shown some steps that you've taken to repair the damage that you've done, right? So it's just a very natural logical process that in order for us to come back to a place where we can stand before God as God's children, blameless, we need to restore mistakes that have been made. We live in an exciting time of history. I'm so glad I wasn't born 6,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, even 200 years ago. I'm glad I wasn't born 200 years ago. In the Old Testament age, right, there's different time periods of history. And humanity, we understand through the divine principle, if you read the chapter, humanity has been raised by the merit of the age throughout history. Little by little, humanity's consciousness, humanity's merit, humanity's morals is slowly being restored. In the Old Testament age, the best people could do, or to hope for, was to be obedient to the laws that God gave them and to have a relationship with God as a master. They just didn't want to make mistakes. They wanted to avoid God's punishment, and if they could do that, they were doing the best they could do. It was a time of an eye for an eye. That was fulfilling their responsibility at that time. But the age that they were living in didn't have any more foundation than that, or understanding to be able to go past that point. In the New Testament age, Jesus brought the understanding that God is not just a master, not someone to just fear and avoid making mad, but that God is a father. And that through love, and through faith, we could be in a relationship with God as God's adoptive children. The law of that time was not like 260-something laws of what to eat, what to not eat. The law of that time was simply love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And since Foundation Day, our true parents have declared that now we are living in the age after the coming of heaven. That's huge words. But what that means is that we now have the foundation, the opportunity to live not as adoptive children to God, but as God's original, true children. It's like we have the potential to live without the baggage of the misery of the past, almost like it didn't exist. We have the potential to live with God and with each other in love the way that God originally intended. Like the fall didn't even happen, simply according to the principles of creation. And in the last part of the introduction to restoration, there's a section of the divine principle called The History of the Providence of Restoration and I. It talks about this. As an individual, each one of us is a product of the history of the providence of restoration. Hence, the person who is to accomplish the purpose of history is none other than I, myself. I must take up the cross of history and accept responsibility to fulfill its calling. To this end, I must fulfill in my lifetime, horizontally, through my efforts, the indemnity conditions which have accumulated through the long course of the providence of restoration, vertically. So just think of history as like a vertical, like Adam and Eve are way from the beginning and you're working way down. Like all those vertical conditions, all of those mistakes, our ancestors, our parents. I have opportunity to fulfill those all right here, horizontally, in my lifetime. Only by doing this can I stand proudly as the fruit of history, the one whom God has eagerly sought throughout his providence. Yet there is no one among fallen humanity who can become such a unhistorical victor by his efforts alone. For this reason, we must understand all these things through Christ at the second advent, who comes to fulfill the providence of restoration. Moreover, when we believe in him, become one with him, and attend him in his work, we can stand in the position of having fulfilled horizontally with him the vertical indemnity conditions in the history of the providence of restoration. So there's a lot of words here, but if you can kind of grasp that all these vertical indemnity conditions are like all the mistakes of history being restored today, then I would argue that this is actually where we are at. This divine principle was written decades ago, and true parents have already declared Foundation Day. True parents have already said, we have completed the providence of the history of restoration. So in some way we could say, this has already happened and we are already here. But you might say, well, I don't feel like that. I still have issues, right? So here's the thing. We have that potential, right? That foundation is already laid. But we each have to, individually and as families, position ourselves so that we can actually live that way. So at this point, it's possible, right? It wasn't possible in the Old Testament age. It wasn't possible in the New Testament age. It is possible now. I know people, despite living in today's world, are still living as if they're living in the Old Testament age, right? They're just like, I just won't break any laws, and God won't punish me. And despite that, the age that we're living in now, I think a lot of us are still struggling to even successfully live in the New Testament age. We still struggle to love God with our whole heart and our whole soul and all of our strength and all of our might. And we still struggle to love our neighbor. So in that way, many of us are still acting like adoptive children to God, still weighted by our past life and mistakes. So even though the environment is ready for us to live fully with God as God's original children, there might still be work that we have to do in our families and in ourselves. I really feel like God is ready and waiting, right? True parents have already invited us to live in the age after the coming of heaven. God's grace is already there for us. But we do need to fulfill our little portion of responsibility. So I really feel like this is the perfect time to have this sermon series on restoration, right? Take that next step, get closer to living that way, because there's nothing that is like making it impossible for us right now. There's just our own mistakes to restore, maybe our parents, maybe something in our families, but it is possible. I've discovered that I had an experience just this week, actually, where I felt like I recognized the need to restore something in our family, and saw that when we made the good condition, it like changed my whole experience of my family and changed my like hopefulness for the future. So just this past week, I became more acutely aware of how device usage in our home was not ideal. Actually, Mike was the one who brought it up. I realized that I personally was kind of struggling with how much I was on my phone or using my device, and my kids also, but because I was struggling with it, I didn't feel confident to like implement rules or changes in the home. But Mike brought it up. He was like, Mia's on her phone all the time. And so it's not her phone. We actually have a phone for the 3 of the older kids to use as needed. And it became apparent that some people overused it. We also have like what we call an educational time in the evenings where our kids can use devices, and the hope of it, or like the idea behind it, was that they could use it to watch documentaries or do something that's educational with devices. We found there's a lot of gray area when it comes to educational time. But really, more importantly, I felt that I was not completely happy with my relationship to technology. I felt like it wasn't bad. Actually, I felt like none of us are using our devices for bad things. It's not like we're watching porn. It's not like we're doing online gambling with our phones or things like that, right? But it wasn't bad. But if I considered my relationship right now, and if nothing were to change, looking at the rest of my life, would I be happy with that? No. Like it's like it wasn't bad enough for me to make an immediate change, but if I thought about it long term, I wasn't happy. So even though none of us are doing anything bad with our devices, the distraction of them, or the overuse of them, was taking away from our relationships with each other, taking away from our relationships with our physical world, and in a way, indirectly taking away from our relationship with God. So once we could just kind of identify that, then we could have a whole conversation with our whole family, and it wasn't like, Mia, you're on the phone too much, and you're the problem. Or it wasn't like, there was nothing shameful about it. There was no punishments or like consequences. It was more like, what is the ideal way that we want to relate with these devices in our home? And then we came up with like what I feel is like a healthy new structure, including for my husband and myself. And it really felt like it's, even since then, there's been a lot more creativity. Mia's been baking things. We've been spending a lot of time outside. We've been just having to interact with each other more, which is a good thing. And so even in this simple example, I feel like there was like a mistake. Like we even unwittingly, unknowingly made mistakes with our priorities with our technology in our home. And we couldn't just say, well, it's not there, or ignore it. We had to rebalance, like make conditions, set guidelines for us to recreate a balance in our home. And in some small way, I feel like it's just one step closer to living in heaven on earth. So if you are at a place where maybe you're feeling stuck, maybe you're feeling unworthy of living in the age of the kingdom, the era after the, what is the word? The age after the coming of heaven. Or maybe the past is still showing up for you in unpleasant ways. Then I invite you to join us for the sermon series on restoration. We're going to spend time talking about, we're going to shed light on what is holding us back. We're going to explore the method for cutting our ties to evil. We're going to be looking at the ways in which fallen natures creep in and show up in our lives, and how we can reverse those fallen natures to really let our original nature shine. And look at the different tools we have for restoring our hearts and for restoring our relationships with each other and with God. And I really believe that if we take these principles of restoration, we take these tools to heart, and we apply them, restoration for real, right? That we'll come out of this series a changed person. And the reason why I asked the music ministry to sing this song is because we do need to be courageous to do it. The reason why I didn't want to address device usage with my kids was because I had to address device usage with myself, and I didn't want to. I had to be courageous enough to just be honest with myself and recognize that I am part of the problem. And so I'm asking you to also be courageous over this next few weeks, to be vulnerable with God, to be honest with yourself, and be open to how God can work to change something, to restore something in your life this month. So we can go forward with new hope, right? Mike talked about last week, we have to have hope. If we don't have hope in our life, it's awful. If we don't have hope that life can be better, or that we can make life better for our children, then there's almost no point, right? So through this series, I hope that we can take that, but once you experience a little bit, even just a little bit of transformation, a little bit of change, it's like we get re-energized. Even if we don't change the whole world, even if everything isn't fixed, it gives us hope that we can continue. And it can give us a taste of what it's like to live as God's true children, right? Not adoptive children. Adoptive children, you have a memory of what the past was like before that point. God wants us to live as though the fall never even happened. Our true parents are saying, we can do that now. But we still need to do a little bit of work on ourselves. So please come with us through this series. And come every Sunday if you can, or listen to our messages afterwards online. And I look forward to spending that time with you. So please join me in prayer. Most beloved Heavenly Parent, thank you so much for a beautiful Sunday morning. Thank you so much for everybody gathered here. We're really so grateful to have this community, to have brothers and sisters that we are walking with on this journey. Heavenly Parent, only you know where we have come from and our ancestors. God, you know all of the restoration that's had to happen throughout all the hundreds and thousands of years leading up to this point. You know what baggage we still carry. You know what mistakes we have made. Yet you are loving us unconditionally, and you believe in us wholeheartedly. You've given us everything we need to live as your children. I just pray that we can have the courage and the humility to receive those things and to make the restoration happen in our lives, Heavenly Parent. Thank you so much for your continuous guidance and love, and I pray you can be with us as we go into this new week. And I offer this prayer in my name, Michael and Adonia Henschrick, Blessed and Chill Family. Amen and adieu. Okay, thank you so much.